relatedly, they are affected most. Also households that, rural households that do not own land, or agriculture farmers, farmers that do not have substantive amounts of land, suffer the most from these kinds of, especially from the food price crisis. How did this vary by income level, income sources, and household characteristics? The bottom line, again, is the poorest of the poor are those who suffer. It's not so much where they live and in which country. It's always the same people that have so little to resort to in times of crisis that get, again, the biggest impact. Within households, we can expect that women and children are affected more heavily, but there is not so much evidence of that. Previous crises have shown some impact on women, women buffering for their children, women eating less or taking on some of the burden. But in terms of children, it's really not that clear. It, again, will depend on the capacity of the household to actually absorb and buffer and protect their children. What are their coping mechanisms? What are the ways that they can actually protect their children? So, as I said, there is no real evidence from the present crisis, and the evidence from previous crises was somewhat unclear, although there were some cases where we could see some impact on women, much less on children. The supply response, there was, the OECD countries did respond swiftly to rising food prices by significantly increasing the supply. The response from the developing countries was sluggish, not surprisingly, because they have chronic constraints to enhancing agricultural productivity growth. They can't just go and increase productivity and production when a shock like this happens. They need a much longer lag. The rise of fertilizer prices also conditioned farmers' supply response to high commodity prices. So farmers were faced with higher fertilizer prices and therefore couldn't turn around and just produce more necessarily. So will food prices increase or decrease in the future? There is no one answer to that. It will depend on all of those factors. The balance between the demand side, how is the demand going to change over time? And it will depend also on the capacity of the supply to respond. There are issues related, how much expansion possibilities are there in terms of area that's cultivated? How much can we increase yields in different environments, et cetera, et cetera. And the enabling policy environment also will affect. And we obviously have the whole series of shocks related to climate change. So what should be an agenda looking forward? And I assume this is speaking as the Gates Foundation, what Prabhu is proposing in terms of an agenda. In the short term, improve our ability to identify the most vulnerable populations, populations that are vulnerable to food prices and increases, as well as to the current economic crisis. We need to be able to monitor better food prices. I think actually there is a pretty good tracking of food prices, but we really don't have a good monitoring or surveillance system to keep track of how nutrition is being affected. We also need early warning systems to be there before it happens. We need to probably be able to track coping mechanisms rather than try to track malnutrition or outcomes that take longer to occur and that have much more detrimental impacts. We need to target resources and attention to these populations in a timely way. We need to identify the most effective safety nets and responses. In the midterm, we need to ensure that critical poverty reduction investments in agricultural development continue, support pathways out of poverty for the vulnerable, and in the long term, identify the agriculture, nutrition, and health policies and investments that are needed to promote economic growth, poverty reduction, and to improve nutrition and health of the rural poor. Thank you.
Thank you. I think what a wonderful combination of a clarity of slides and a beautiful improvisation of delivery. you could work at the Improv. So now we had a Quebecois who lives in Washington, a British man who lives in Boston. We have an American man who lives in Switzerland. This is geographic diversity. And the next and last speaker in the set, I hope he's still here, yes, is Niels Christensen, who is Vice President for Public Affairs at the Nestle headquarters in Vevey, and he will speak on the same 3 questions. Niels.
Thank you, Noel. And I want to say, first of all, what a pleasure it is to be here in Thailand, where I think a great deal of progress, as we heard this morning, has been made in improving nutrition security and decreasing malnutrition. And I'm pleased to say that there's been a good public-private collaboration here, which our company has been able to be a part of, together with NGOs who are focused particularly on rural development and health improvement. I want to look back a little bit further than my previous 2 speakers and look starting back in 1950 through 1990. According to FAO, actually the price of agricultural products indexed to wages has decreased dramatically between 1950 and 1990. This had to be one of the major factors in the decrease in child mortality that we've seen, health improvements in many ways. It probably also helped to contribute to the obesity problem we have by affluent people or people in middle class, even in places like Bangladesh, having access to cheaper food. But I think we can all agree that cheaper food plus economic development in places like China and India and other countries have helped to create actually a positive story globally, obviously uneven around the world, for mortality and malnutrition. Now, coming back to the recent history, this data is very similar to what was presented by the previous 2 speakers. Actually, the current food crisis that we entered started before it was reported in the press, started long before 2008, but we see where it reached its peak, has fallen in recent years and months, but is climbing back up a little bit. But still, we are quite a bit above where we were in 2000, as you can see. So our food prices have increased from 2000, even with this recent drop. If you allow me to make an inference from hunger to undernutrition, according to FAO, the number of undernourished people, they say hungry, but I assume hunger leads to undernourishment, has increased recently, as we previously saw, as both speakers referred to. And if we compare that to where the Millennium Development Goals are aiming for, we're clearly going in the wrong direction. We are a bit less sanguine about the future, and primarily due to the crisis in water availability. Franks Riesbergman, who's director of the International Water Management Institute in Sri Lanka, says that if the present trend continues of increasing scarcity of water, about 1/3 of the world's population will be affected by water scarcity by 2025. And he says that we could be facing annual losses equivalent to the entire grain crop of India and U.S. combined. Now that is a scary statement being made by someone who I think knows quite a bit about water. And here's a map of the regions where water withdrawals are exceeding natural supply. It may be hard to get excited about water scarcity here in Thailand, but if you look at big agricultural producing areas, the Midwest and west of the U.S., the Ogallala Aquifer, if you look at Spain having severe problems with water, the Punjab in northern India, the breadbasket of India, where now farmers are drilling down 245 meters in order to reach water, and every year have to go down another meter and